Welcome to Incentives Matter, your guide to what's new in behavioral science and behavioral economics. Let's see what's really driving decisions.
It seems completely counterintuitive, doesn't it? The Federal Reserve raises interest rates specifically to combat inflation, to cool down an overheating economy. Yet, according to new research, a significant number of people actually interpret these rate hikes as a sign that inflation is getting worse.
That's precisely the fascinating paradox the paper explores. The general public, or what the researchers refer to as doers, individuals directly engaged in economic activity like spending and earning, often perceive the Fed's actions not as a cure, but as a symptom of a deeper problem, or even a catalyst for further price increases. It's a fundamental disconnect in how monetary policy is understood.
So the central bank is trying to put out the fire, but people are looking at the firefighters arriving and thinking, wow, this fire must be really bad if they're sending so many trucks.
A very apt analogy. The researchers really dive into why this perception gap exists, and it has profound implications for how effective monetary policy can be, especially when it relies on managing public expectations.
To unpack this further, from the Fed's perspective, raising rates is about making borrowing more expensive, which slows demand, and that's supposed to bring prices down. Where does the public's interpretation diverge?
The divergence, according to the research, stems from how individuals process economic information, especially when it comes to salient, immediate changes versus abstract, long-term policy goals. When the Fed announces a rate hike, what do people experience? Suddenly, their mortgage payments might go up, car loans become more expensive, or credit card interest rates climb. These are direct, painful, and often immediate costs.
So they're feeling the pinch of the medicine, not necessarily seeing the immediate effect on the disease it's meant to treat.
Exactly. For many, the most tangible effect of a rate hike isn't a sudden drop in grocery prices. It's the increased cost of their own debt. This direct experience can lead to an attribution error. They see their personal costs rising after a Fed announcement, and they associate that rise with inflation continuing or even accelerating, rather than recognizing it as a necessary step to curb future inflation.
It's like if you go to the doctor with a fever, and the doctor gives you a shot and your arm hurts afterwards. You might focus on the pain in your arm and think, this isn't helping me feel better, it's making me feel worse, forgetting the shot is meant to fight the underlying infection.
A perfect analogy for the doer perspective. The research highlights that individuals often form their inflation expectations not just from official statistics or central bank pronouncements, but from their daily experiences and immediate economic indicators. Higher borrowing costs are a very salient indicator. They're a bad news signal that many people interpret as a sign of economic distress, which they then link to inflation.
This isn't just about misunderstandings, though, is it? There's a behavioral component here. What cognitive mechanisms are at play that lead to this misinterpretation?
Several behavioral mechanisms contribute. One is the concept of salience. Rate hikes are major news items. They're discussed everywhere, from financial news outlets to kitchen tables. This makes them highly salient events. When something is highly salient, it often looms larger in our mental models and can disproportionately influence our perceptions.
So the very act of the Fed making a big public move to combat inflation might inadvertently amplify the perception of inflation as a problem because everyone is talking about it.
Precisely. Another mechanism is the availability heuristic. People tend to estimate the likelihood or frequency of an event based on how easily examples or instances come to mind. When borrowing costs are increasing and the news is full of inflation discussions, it becomes easier to recall instances of rising prices and harder to envision a future where inflation is under control. This reinforces the idea that things are getting worse.
And then there's likely some element of confirmation bias, where once someone starts to believe inflation is worsening due, in part, to rate hikes, they'll seek out and interpret information in a way that confirms that belief.
Absolutely. If you already have that initial perception, any further news about price increases or economic slowdowns can be folded into that existing narrative, solidifying the idea that the Fed's actions aren't working or are even counterproductive. The paper points out that this isn't necessarily about a lack of intelligence, but about the shortcuts people take to make sense of complex economic information.
It also brings up the idea of direct versus indirect experiences. The Fed operates at a macroeconomic level, dealing with aggregates and long-term trends. Most individuals operate at a microeconomic level, dealing with their household budget and immediate financial concerns.
That's a crucial distinction. The doer experiences the economy through their personal finances, their job, their consumption patterns. The Fed views the economy through models, data, and policy levers. These two perspectives are often misaligned. When the Fed raises rates, it's a decision based on broad economic indicators and a forecast of future inflation. But for an individual, it's a direct impact on their spending power, their ability to borrow, their financial stress. The benefits of reduced inflation are often delayed and diffused, whereas the costs of higher rates are immediate and concentrated.
So the researchers aren't saying rate hikes actually make inflation worse, but that they make people think it's getting worse. How did they actually measure this perception? Did they just ask people?
The research employed a variety of methods, including surveys and experiments, to gauge public perception. They asked people directly about their inflation expectations after being presented with hypothetical scenarios involving rate hikes. They found that a significant portion of respondents, when informed of a rate hike, revised their inflation expectations upwards, not downwards. This was especially true for individuals with less economic literacy or those who primarily rely on their immediate experiences.
That's a powerful finding. It's not just a casual observation, it's a measured effect. What are the implications of this misperception for the central bank and for the economy more broadly?
The implications are substantial. If a large segment of the population believes that inflation is worsening because of rate hikes, it can undermine the effectiveness of monetary policy. Central banks rely heavily on managing inflation expectations. If people expect prices to continue rising, they might demand higher wages, and businesses might raise prices preemptively, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy.
The very act of trying to anchor expectations could, in this scenario, inadvertently de-anchor them in the wrong direction.
Precisely. It makes the Fed's job much harder. Their policy is intended to slow inflation, but if public perception interprets it as a sign of worsening inflation, it can actually fuel those inflationary pressures through behavioral channels. It's a communication challenge of the highest order. The Fed isn't just setting policy, it's also managing a complex psychological landscape.
So, what does this research suggest about how central banks should communicate their actions? Is it about dumbing down the message, or is it about reframing it entirely?
The research doesn't offer a prescriptive communication strategy, but it certainly highlights the need for one that goes beyond simply stating the facts. It implies that central banks need to be highly attuned to how their actions are perceived by the average doer, not just by financial markets or economic experts. The current communication strategy, which is often very technical and data-driven, might not resonate with the public's lived experience.
It's almost as if they need to explain the purpose and the mechanism of the medicine, rather than just announcing they've given the shot.
Exactly. They might need to emphasize the lag effect of monetary policy, explaining that the benefits of rate hikes in terms of lower inflation won't be felt immediately, but the costs to borrowers are often front-loaded. They could also try to connect their actions more directly to tangible future benefits that people can understand, such as stable prices for everyday goods, rather than just quoting abstract inflation targets.
But that's a tightrope walk, isn't it? Because if they over-explain or sound too apologetic about the immediate pain, it could be seen as a lack of confidence, which could also undermine their credibility.
It's definitely a delicate balance. The paper suggests that a more nuanced understanding of public psychology is crucial. It's not about being less transparent, but about being more effective in communication by acknowledging the behavioral biases at play. It's about translating the macroeconomic rationale into something that makes intuitive sense from a microeconomic, lived experience perspective.
This has implications beyond just monetary policy, doesn't it? It speaks to a broader challenge in communicating any complex policy, whether it's public health measures or environmental regulations, where the immediate costs are clear, but the long-term, diffused benefits are harder to grasp.
Absolutely. The principles are transferable. Any policy intervention that has immediate, salient, and often negative impacts on individuals, while its intended benefits are delayed, abstract, or distributed, faces a similar communication hurdle. Understanding how people attribute cause and effect, especially when they're directly experiencing a consequence, is key to designing more effective public communication campaigns for any complex issue.
The central idea from this fascinating research is that the public often misunderstands the intent and effect of interest rate hikes. First, people associate the pain of higher borrowing costs directly with worsening inflation, rather than seeing it as a necessary step to curb it.
And second, this misperception is driven by behavioral biases like salience and the availability heuristic, where immediate and prominent information trumps more abstract economic reasoning.
Third, this creates a significant challenge for central banks, as their efforts to control inflation can inadvertently fuel negative inflation expectations through this behavioral channel.
And finally, effective communication from central banks requires a deeper understanding of public psychology, moving beyond technical explanations to address the doer's perspective and managing the immediate discomfort alongside the long-term benefits.
This raises the question of how much broader economic understanding is shaped not by objective data, but by these very human, very immediate perceptions. How much does what people feel about the economy dictate what they believe about it, even in the face of expert consensus?
And for policymakers, the question becomes, how do you design interventions that aren't just economically sound, but also behaviorally intelligent, so the message matches the intent?
That's all for this episode of Incentives Matter. Join us next time as we keep unpacking what really drives decisions. Thanks for listening. Choose wisely, or at least know why you didn't.